Greetings, everybody. I'm Jenny Neville, and I'm still delighted, nevertheless, to welcome you to this first of our 4 seminars on early medieval identities. And I'm especially delighted to have the honor of introducing our first speaker, Professor Emeritus Susan Westhuizen. Now, Professor Westhuizen is Professor of Medieval Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. She's also a Senior Fellow of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. And I don't know how you feel about your titles, Professor Westhuizen, but I think it's really important to have that sort of range out so that we know what kind of person you are and what kind of depth you have. These titles show us what you're committed to, and that's part of the reason why I'm so very glad to have you speaking to us today. Your commitment to your field, but also your commitment to talking to other people about it and to spreading your research around. Now, her interdisciplinary research, which is what we're all looking forward to hearing about today, it focuses on what landscapes can tell us about people living in England between 400 and 1300 AD. That's huge, but more specifically, Professor Westhuizen explores the evidence in the ground for how people organized themselves, how they governed themselves, and how they saw themselves. And so her research is really a key starting point for our series and our investigation into early medieval identities. Professor Westhuizen has a long and distinguished publication record, but I think it's fair to say that her recent publication, which Megan's mentioned already, The Emergence of the English Rethinking the Evidence, it represents, I think, a culmination of an important argument that she's been building for some time. And that argument is that we need to think again about our narratives of early English identity. Indeed, we need to step back from the narratives offered to us by our favorite writers like Bede, and to think about what happened with, for example, practices related to common property rights, rather than simply accept what later writers, how they interpreted the events of their own past. Now, of course, other scholars have expressed doubts about Bede's story before, but the evidence that Professor Westhuizen's discussion offers, it offers us a really strong counter-narrative, a different kind of story, which is something that I think we've really needed. So today, Professor Westhuizen is going to be exploring how her research can lead us to think differently about early medieval identities. And her lecture today is entitled Early Medieval Collective Identity in the Context of the Longue Durée. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Right. Here we go. Well, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, especially as it's turning out to be sunny where I am and you're not in the garden. Today I want to talk about social identity in the Fenland, in the East Anglian Fenland, between about the beginning of the 5th century and the mid-13th century. By the end of this talk, what I hope to have demonstrated is that significant elements of early medieval social identity, social relations, were deliberately perpetuated into the mid-13th century across very nearly a millennium. And actually, my own suspicion is it goes back a lot further than that. And that this was really important for a significant number of peasants, regardless of the changes that had happened over the course of that millennium, some of which were really very significant, and we'll talk about those in a while. So I was hoping my thing will move forward. Right, this way, here we go. So this is roughly where we're going to be going over the next 40 to 50 minutes or so. I want to say something by way of introduction. I want to talk about the evidence so you can see the evidence I've been using, about its reliability. And then I want to say something in explanation of why I think these things persisted for such a long time. And that breaks down into 2 general categories, one about territory and common rights and social relations, which are all interlinked, and another about environment and livelihood, What I want to show is that these form a total nexus. You can't understand one aspect of it without understanding all of it. And then I want to say something about how that narrative can be modeled and then draw a brief conclusion. So that's roughly where we're going to be going. Well, the model that I've chosen is this one. It's the diagram is made by C.S. Holling. And basically what it shows, he's down here on the right. Basically what it shows is change on 3 axes. So at the back here, there's change that happens over a very, very long time. That happens so slowly that even over the course of one's own lifetime or a number of lifetimes, change is barely perceptible. At the other end of the scale, there are changes that are fast, can be quite small, can be quite big. I mean, for example, large-scale weather events or plagues, pestilence, sort of things that we're well familiar with today. These things, sometimes they will have a long-term impact, but sometimes they'll disappear. The impact will disappear quite quickly. And when they do have a longer-term impact, they meet the long-term here and the short-term, they meet in the middle term. And there are other processes, for example, climate change or changes in economic structure can sometimes take a long time to be formed, so on. And in some cases, those changes are ameliorated by long-term traditions. And in other times, the small and fast changes are so severe that they have quite a knock-on impact in the middle term. So it's quite a complex picture. It's a 3-dimensional picture, 4 including time, of the past, the immediate present, and the not so long ago past. And the 4 thinkers who've influenced me are these 4. So Braudel is famous for his formulation of the longue durée, that is, changes that take place very slowly over long periods of time. So this is definitely Braudel's territory. Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, wrote probably one of the most unreadable but incredibly important books of all time. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but a very important book. His formulation is an anthropologist, and his formulation was a concept that he called habitus, which are the things that we learn inarticulately from our parents about what we are allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and things that might be allowed. So we learn the parameters of our behavior, and because that behavior is learned inarticulately by example, it's very difficult and very slow to change. So to that extent, Bourdieu and Braudel are describing the same thing, but from different perspectives, one a historian and another an anthropologist. The third is Eleanor Ostrom, and she's an economist who won a Nobel Prize for her work. She argued that rights of common, her specialism, rights of common were so generally structured that they provided once more a framework of what people who participated in the governance and the exploitation of commons, it gave them a framework of what they were allowed to do in terms of governance, what was completely not allowed, and gave them ideas of what might be allowed. So it again echoed Braudel, but in a completely different economic context. And then we come to Holling, whose diagram of what he called panarchy, I've just shown you, and you can see that Holling is describing the same thing. So all these thinkers describing the same thing, but from completely different perspectives. And that gives me a certain amount of confidence that actually there might be something in it. Well, now the area that we're going to be looking at is the East Anglian Fenland. And you can see where it is. It's in this box over here on the top right-hand corner of southern England. And it's a very large, low-lying basin. So everything that you can see in white here lies above the medieval floodline. That was dry ground. Everything that is white is dry ground. And you can see there are islands of dry ground here. Everything that is dark grey was land that could be flooded in winter. And actually, if you go into the fens even now in winter, huge parts of them are flooded. So everything that is grey here lies beneath the winter flood line. Some of it lies below sea level and it's permanently inundated. But in the medieval period, everything that was grey here could be covered by water in winter or in other times of flood. And that was the basis for huge growth in peat, beginning in the Neolithic, which by the medieval period had reached depths of up to 3 to 5 meters in some places. Whoops, sorry. And then lastly, the area to the north are what are called the silt fens. And these are marine silts. So every time the sea flooded into the Finland basin, which was perfectly possible because so much of it was so low lying, it deposited a layer of silt which had been brought in with it. So when the sea retreated again, the silt lands, which are slightly higher than they had been before. And so every time this happened, more and more silt was deposited until the land eventually became habitable. And that seems to have been round about, I don't know, between 500 and 600 AD. The area that I'm particularly interested though is the peat fen. So that's the bit that we're going to be looking at this today. And then finally, the area, specifically the geography that I'm going to be looking at is the area with which the Abbey of Ely was endowed in 673 AD. And so these are the parishes as they were in the 13th, well, actually in the 19th century. So don't worry about the coloring in. What I'm really interested in is the shape. And you can see that the Abbey controlled large parts of the peat fen. So that's the bit that we're going to be looking at. So now the evidence that I'm going to be exploring is that of something called the Ely Coucher Book. The Ely Coucher Book is a series of extensive records that the manors it's a series of records made for the Bishop of Ely, who wanted to know how much land he had in each manor, what it was used for, how many tenants he had, what labor he was entitled to from them, how much money he could get out of them, so on. So it was a complete record of his income and the sources of his income from each of his manors. It was made, there were 2 of these books made, one in 1222, which is not called a Coucher Book, and the other one in 1249 to 50, which is called the Coucher Book because it's so fat that it could only be kept lying down. So it was couché, it was asleep. So the Coucher Book is a really important record because the bishop owned, although it, you can see he doesn't own the whole of that area. It was divided between the bishopric and the abbey in about 1109. But you can see he owns a very large proportion of the Finland. Each of his manors was coincident with the parish or the modern parish. So you're getting the picture of the whole parish. And what you're getting there is a picture of a whole landscape in which the units are almost always contiguous with one another. And then they ask the same questions in each place at more or less the same date. So you're getting consistency of data over a very wide geographic area, and that makes a really important contribution to understanding the landscape as a whole. It's a coherent, consolidated landholding. Now, the people that I'm particularly interested in are 3 groups. So I know you're going to be distracted by the writing, so we'll talk to you about the writing in a moment. They come in 3 groups. The first group is a group called hundreders. The second is a group who own land which is called ware acres. And the third group is a group who pay a rent called farthing. Okay, so those are the 3 groups. So this is the first group, and they're hundreders. So each of these paragraphs, the first one is from one manor, the second one is from another, and they tell you what the person owns. So I'll talk to you about the technicalities, the jargon of each one as we go through. So we'll just look at what Robert of the Hall owns first, and then we'll go on to William Tosti, and then I'll talk to you about the jargon. So Robert has got 40 acres. And because he has those acres, he has to go to the 100 Court to the manorial court at Ely, the episcopal court at Ely, to each 100 court, and to the manorial court of his own manor. He pays a special payment called 60th penny and another called ward penny. And he's entitled to appear before the justices as a free man. So this guy's he's beholden to no one, he's a free man. Similarly, William Tosti, he also pays 60th penny. He pays another payment called bridge silver. But then look, he also has to pay 2 suits of court in Ely and to the manorial court in Doddington. He performs boons, but he doesn't perform the weekly works that were required from villeins. And then he undertakes carrying duties for the bishop, and he goes with the bishop's representative to enforce the bishop's rule across his estates. So now what do all these things mean? Well, let's start with ware acres. Ware acres are holdings to which public obligations are attached. That is, if you have a ware acre, you are required to pay particular rents which go to a territory rather than to a person. They don't go to the manor. They go, in this case, to the 100. The particular payments go to the 100. 60th penny used to be a payment of 60 pence to 120 acres, to what was called the hide. But by the time we get to the mid-13th century, it's clearly not that any longer. And ward penny is a commutation of the expectation that you should join the military, the local army, the Fed, when you're required to defend your territory against someone else. So those are the things he must do. He must turn up in court, and he must pay these 2 payments which go to the 100. And the culture book says that those 2 payments do go to the 100. They don't go to the bishop. And the court that he attends is the 100 court, the court of the community to which he belongs, which has precedence over the manorial courts. And you can see that William Tosti does the same thing. He pays 60th penny. He has to pay suit of court. He must pay the boons. Now, the boons look like labor services, so they look as though they're similar to villain services, but they are also public responsibilities that originated in voluntary labor, which went to a polity or to the kings of a very early polity. And when I say early, I'm talking about the 5th century, possibly the 6th. We're really talking very, very early period. And that these are boons, these are favors, which are given in labor at times of particular agricultural pressure. So for example, at harvest. Rosamond Faith says they're originally part of the attendance on the person of the king. So these aren't things that you need to be ashamed of doing. They're signs of status because you're in a position where you're able to give a favor to somebody of higher status. So I just want to show you how this works. So in order to get this kind of holding, a ware land holding, you had to fulfill 2 criteria. So this is, I'm talking again about the 5th and 6th centuries, perhaps as late as, I don't know, I mean, I really don't know, but I'm guessing perhaps as late as the early 9th century. You had to be a member of the territory. And sometimes that territory was defined as the folk. Sometimes it was defined as kin, but actually kin simply because you treated other people as though they were kin. They didn't actually have to be kin. So you had to be a member of the territory in which you wanted to have land. And you had to be a free man. So you had to fulfill both those criteria. If you did, then you were entitled to rights of property when you came of age. And those rights of property came in 2 interlocking parts. One was land that you could use, farm on your own account to support an extended household. I say in severalty, it's not really, I mean, that's a bit of a modern interpretation, but it's not a bad shorthand. It's land that you controlled yourself, and you could buy and sell it but you couldn't, but it was your own, you could do anything you liked within it, provided that you didn't obviously impinge on anything that your neighbors were doing. So that was one part. And the second part of the property rights that you had was that they were common rights in the natural resources belonging to the territory. So for example, in pasture, in woodland, in fishing or whatever. So you got rights of property. But along with those property rights came responsibilities. You had to participate in the governance of the territory. You had to come to the assemblies at which the laws of the territory were recited, created, amended. You had to bear arms on behalf of the territory. And then you had to supply public renders or service to the center. So here we have suit of court. You have to participate in assemblies. You have to pay ward penny. That is a commutation. You pay in money instead of actually doing it to bear arms. And then you do the boon services and the carrying services and the going with the bailiff, and all these things that help to keep the territory ticking over. And so you can see that what is implicit in what I'm saying is that these very early medieval territories eventually, of course, by the time you get to the 10th century, have evolved into what we now call hundreds. But the origins of many of them, not all, but the origins of many of them do go back to very early period. And so these rights and responsibilities are characteristic of the very early period of the post-Roman centuries. And to see them again in the culture book really is very exciting. So now wereland comes in two. Wereland comes, it's again one of two sorts. So wereland holding, here you can see he's got his area in, well, I've called it severalty, but it's a shorthand. So this is the land where he keeps his, he has his farmhouse, he has his dependent labor, he has his fields, and so on, all around. All of this is land that he controls himself. This illustration is taken from an Irish excavation, but I think there's a good consonance between the two sets of evidence. And then further afield, the man who owns this territory, this holding, has rights of common in the natural resources of the territory lying beyond. And so one can imagine a series, if you're looking at a territory against series of these small warland holdings set in the wider landscape of commonable resources. And somewhere out there, there will be a territorial center which may or may not, by the early medieval period, be controlled by somebody which, for reasons I don't really understand, we call a king. So this is where they are all distributed in the culture book. This is where they go. The next lot are free tenants. They're not called hundreders. They don't hold from the 100, but they also hold ware acres. He also owns suit to the 100. He pays 60 penny and ward penny. He does the boons and he does the going with the bailiff. So there's no difference between them except he's not called a hundreder. I'm not sure that that's really important. But there were also customary tenants, villeins, in that period, who are also holding ware acres, and they do none of the things that the free tenants can do. But nonetheless, there is a memory that their land originated in warland, in the land of the territory, which only the king was able to dispense. And when you look at the distribution of them, you can see they go right the way across the southern parts of the abbey estate. So now this is the entirety, you remember, is the land that was granted to the Abbey of Ely in 673. And I haven't got time now to explain to you why that is the case, but I think that's pretty well demonstrated. And then finally, there's a payment called farthing. And I'm sorry there are so many of them, but I just wanted to show you there's such a consonance here. They're free tenants. Sometimes they're called tenants who are there by custom, or tenants who only pay rent. Sometimes they're just holders of land. But each of them has got a message. a house with a plot around it, and attached to the message is a payment called farthing. See here in Upwell and Outwell, 25 people each hold a message, and they all pay farthing. And that's the totality of the entry in the culture book. They've got the house and they pay farthing. In Wisbech, Emma has a message and she pays farthing, and she does a few extra things with Boonworks, and she does the things that we've seen the hundreders do elsewhere. Again, the rent-paying tenants, message and a farthing. And the Vergates of land, they pay a rent for the land, but they also pay 2.5 pence farthing. So what is farthing? Let's go back. I'll go back there. So what is farthing? Farthing is a quarter. Of course, it's quarter of a penny. And it's a payment that was made to the subunit of a much larger territory. So if you imagine the whole of that abbey holding that I've shown you in 673, it's divided into 400s, of which Wisbech 100 is one, and all these tenants are in Wisbech 100. And they pay to Wisbech 100 a farthing, because Wisbech 100 is a quarter of the area that was given to Ely in 673. And that payment predates the gift in 673. This is earlier than that. It's paid to the territory, not to the abbey. But by the time we see it in the 13th century, the bishop has decided this money is jolly well his and he's going to have it. And so actually now it's become part of his own payments. But originally it was not. And then finally, also only in Wisbech 100, there are villeins who pay a money rent. Well, there used to be a money rent called gavel. By this time, it's been made into a labor rent, but the gavel is a tribute payment in cash to very, very early medieval territories, before the kingdoms, before the extensive estates, before manorialism. So these are really ancient rents and rights that we can see in the Fenland in the mid-13th century. And what they show is that people's status is derived from their holdings. This isn't a status they've inherited personally. The status is inherited from their holdings. They're mostly free. They pay suit of court. They're law-worthy. They used to contribute to the army, to the feared. They're feared-worthy. And they pay distinctive public services and payments. And the thing is that Finland is not unique. So sorry, this is just the map of them across Finland as a whole. You can see it, they vary across the Finland, but they're nonetheless within the category of things that are paid to a public territory, not to a manor, and that predates the manor. They go across the Finland. And these are examples that you can find across England. And I haven't done the research on those areas, and I'm honestly unlikely to do it. So, you know, be my guest, go out there and see whether things are the same there as I think they are in Finland, or if they are not, because either way, it's going to be interesting. So how reliable is that evidence from the mid-15th century? And so there are 3 questions that follow from that. The first is, was the second set of extents in 1349 to 50 the same, just a copy of the one in 1222? And the answer is no, it isn't. The one in 1222 had very much less detail, and the names of the tenants are different. So you can see there are similarities between the two, but one is a portrait of 1222 and the other is a portrait of 1249 to 50. Secondly, when one looks at the kinds of holdings that I've shown you, could they still be created in the 13th century? Because if they were, how could one then argue that they go all the way back to the early medieval period? And thirdly, how stable their numbers were, partly another part of that same question, could they still be created? Well, now here's an example from Doddington. So in 1222, these are all the holdings which pay 60th penny, ward penny, suit of court, all the things that I've shown you. And they come to a total of 118 acres. And they're divided between 12 holders, called hundreders, because they hold from the 100. But in 1249 to 50, about 25, just over 25 years later, the number of acres is the same, but the number of hundreders has doubled. They can't create new ones. The only way they can create more hundreders is by subdividing what they've got. And you can see the same thing at Little Port. Whoops. At Little Port in 1086, there are 174 acres divided between 15 tenants. And you can see in 1222, again, 15 tenants, same number of acres. By 1249 to 50, the bishop wants more tenants because he gets more labor from them. Number of tenants has gone up to 23, but the number of acres remains the same. And the only way he's been able to do it is by subdividing the existing ware acres. You couldn't make new public holdings at this time. And I think the evidence from Little Port, where the numbers are the same from 1086, suggests that you couldn't make them before that. The last time that these holdings were made was probably long before 1086. They were already archaic by that time. And I just want to show you, this is a record of one of those subdivisions at Doddington. So here's Ralph. He's got 6 acres in 1222. So by 25 years later, his son has got 5 acres of it. And his daughter has got 1/4 of an acre of it. And look what they've done. Roger, he's got 60th penny, and he does all the posh stuff. He goes to suit of court, and he does the boon works, and he goes out with the bailiff, but he doesn't pay money towards Aldrich Causeway, which is another something that goes with the estate rather than with the 100. It's not a public obligation. And then he hands out other little bits. So he doesn't want to pay all the 60th penny, so the parson also gets 60th penny. And Goldbeer is I think Ralph must have sublet a bit to this guy, but by the time we see it in 1249, the parson's got it. And so he does the stuff that Ralph doesn't feel like doing. He pays a bit of 60th penny, he pays a boon and some more of the boons. And then Margaret, who's Roger's sister, holds 1/4, and she doesn't pay 60th penny because I think she's probably too poor, but she does pay a bit towards the bridge. And then they've got this guy, Peter, son of Adam, and he's got just over 1/4 of an acre of that land. And he pays 60th penny, but he doesn't have a message because the parson's got it for all the service. So you can see that what they're doing is they're creating people. There are people who are so desperate to have that free status, which goes with the holding, that they'll take just message a house, or they'll take just 1.5 roods of land in order to get that status. It's still really, really important to them then. And you can see that they're not counted in Doomsday Book. The number of tenants is roughly the same in 1250 as it was in 1086. But these are holdings that are made before the conquest. And look at all these people that were missing from Doomsday Book. And if you add them up, a bit speculative, but when you add them up, you find that around 1/3 of the population was not counted in Doomsday Book. Basically, the extramanorial, and the Normans weren't interested. So they're not there. But what that means is actually there's really quite a large population, a large free population in Finland by the late 11th century, the roots of whose freedom lay in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. So how do we explain that persistence? Well, I'm going to look at it in 2 ways. I'm going to look at territory, and then I'm going to look at the environment. So that's roughly speaking where we're going to go. Well, everybody else had a picture, so I thought the great Nellie Nielsen should have a picture as well. Nellie Nielsen plotted rights of common in the Finland in about 1920. So here you can see this dark area. This is all the peat fen, and these are all the fen islands. This is Ely over here, peat fen. And then you can see all these pins. So the head of each pin is a vil. I mean, nowadays we'd call it the village, but it means the community as well as the place. Each of those heads is where the village is today. And the sharp end of the pin is where each group of villages commons. So you can see there's each group commons in a particular place. This is from Lincolnshire, the people of Spalding. This is Wisbech, they common here. These are people in Norfolk, they're common down here. But when you look at Ely, of course, it's a jumble. And I'll come back to that in a while. So Nielsen concluded that this geography was very ancient, because what she found was that when you looked at the manners, you looked at the geography of manners, it didn't in any way coincide with the commons at all. And moreover, each commoner had the same status as other commoners, whether you were a lord or whether you were the lowest peasant. And there were cases, medieval cases, people going to the medieval courts of the fen and taking the lords of the manor to task for breaching the regulations of the common and winning. So they were equitable amongst them. And she said there's a number of reasons why she said that these rights went right the way back to what she called the earliest period, that is, to the immediate years after the withdrawal of Roman administration. Then she was a historian, not an archaeologist, and I think there's some evidence to show that these rights originated long before that. So Ostrom shows that rights of common are very important and they have particular characteristics. They're property rights. They're defensible in law. That's so important. They're legal rights. And they're held by an exclusive group. Rights of common are not public rights. They're exclusive. They belong to only the free men of each vil, which I've shown you already, the hundreders and so on. And they relate to a particular defined resource, so that it's a bounded area. So in this case, I'm interested in common pasture, but the boundaries of that pasture will be known, because if you've got legal rights, you have to know where your rights begin and where they end, and where your neighbors begin and end. And they're collectively governed. So these commons are collectively governed, because if everybody has rights of access to it, one person governing it means that actually your rights can be eroded. The only way to make sure that your own rights are protected is if everybody participates in governance. And there's a principle of equity as well. Each commoner is equal to the other for exactly the same reason. And you're expected to participate because in the governance of the common, because if you don't, somebody can say, well, I didn't expect you to, you can't say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't agree to that. And then you're not allowed to take more than your fair share. And because a common is made up of a number of individuals who the lifetime of the common itself and of its governance is not predicated on the death of one individual. It doesn't stop just because I die. If I die, somebody else comes in, because there are 50 other people who will continue to govern the common. So they have the potential to last for a very, very long time. And you can see this in a document called the Tribal Hidage, which was written, perhaps drawn up in about the late 7th century, perhaps. And it identifies the names of a number of relatively small polities who a variety of scholars have identified as being located around the edge of the Fenland Basin. So the Spaldingers are here, these are the Widderigers, here the Yowie, the so on and so on, all the way through. And then you can see in the center, there's nothing in the Tribal Hidage, and that is, but there is a group here called the Ely, which is mentioned by Bede as having been given to Ethelthryth in 673 because it belonged to the Kingdom of East Anglia. So it already existed. All these existed by the later 7th century, and you can see how well they conform both to Nielsen's conclusion that each of these groups is a polity, a territory, How they were ruled, we don't know. People say kings, but we don't really know. So this takes us right the way back to the late 7th century, and I keep telling you, I think it's earlier. And then by the time you get into, by the time you get looking at the detail of the endowment of Ethelthryth's Abbey, you can see we're looking at 400s. And each of these is 100 there, Wisbeach 100, North with Wychford 100, South Wychford 100, and Ely 100. And each of these hundreds is occupied by people who have ware acres, who pay farthing, who are called hundreders, who pay suit of court. These quarters, I think, were already there by the time we get to 673, because this area was Bede called a province. It was bigger than the usual little polities around the side. This was a really rather large area. So I just want to say something about rights of property. So this is how property rights worked. You could see this, I showed you this before. If you wanted to have property rights, you had to be free. So there are obviously a ruler of some sort, or perhaps not obviously. There's an elite. We can see this in the burial archaeology, and there are others across a continuum. And then there are yet other groups who don't get property rights, and those are unfree labor, which again goes right the way back into the Roman period. The rights of common do something different. Rights of common bring all these four together, these three groups together into a single governance unit based on equity between them. So what you're looking at, it's far more than a property right. It's a reasonable standard of prosperity with particular informal benefits. What this means is that you can network with people across the social hierarchy. You can do a favor to somebody who's much, much more important than you on the basis that next year he might do something for you. When you meet at the roundups in the autumn, or when you're taking the cattle out in the spring, or when you're meeting at the 100 courts, there are marriages being arranged, there are sales being arranged, there are disputes being settled, there's feasting and partying, all part of the social interaction of being a freeman who's entitled to rights of property and whose common rights give him access to that kind of secondary, secondary networking. So now I've gone too slowly. So I've made my slides go too slowly. So I'm going to take you right the way towards the end. Really what I wanted to show you was that I've failed, and what I wanted to show you and failed is that the collectivity was extremely important in managing the commons. The commons weren't just something where you could let the cattle out in the spring and call them back in the autumn. It needed a lot of management. You had to move the cattle from one area of grazing to another to keep the grazing in good heart. You had to understand where the fertility of the commons came from. You had to arrange for it to be watered adequately. You had to manage the ditches. You had to cut out the weeds. It took an awful lot of management. It was all done collectively by the commoners. So what you're looking at is a system where there's a system of rights. It has social rights which connect you to the elite. It's absolutely bound up in the way that the landscape it's absolutely bound up in the environment, in the wetness of the fens, in the times where it's dry. It's how you negotiate that wetness and dryness between you. So the landscape and the common rights are inextricably bound together. So what I want to show you here now, I think this is where I want to start. Excuse me a minute, just while I try and make sure that I know what I'm doing. Okay, yes, so here's the story. This is the story. Okay, right. So now the striking feature of the Fenland is this long-term continuity in its character over very nearly a millennium, and in the shared property rights through which they were exploited. So that means that gave a secure foundation for smaller and larger changes in other spheres, in the balance between different sorts of environment, in the fen itself, in the resources, in population, in emerging rights of private property, in changes to the economy and social hierarchy, and so on. So we start off with what we know to be the earliest. This is the kingdom, or the regio, the province of the Ely in 673. And you can see that although some of these rights of common are local, like these ones up here, others, look, if you're in Ely, you can common right the way out there. And up here, and all the way down there. There are, these rights are quite jumbled.
Susan, we can't see your slides right now.
Oh, can't see my darn slides. Sorry, you're quite right.
No, it's all right.
Why did I not do that? Sorry. Okay. I'm so sorry. Right. Here we go. Start again. Right, so I'm sorry, here is, you can see it now, can't you? Okay, tell me if you don't.
Yes, we can see now.
Good. So this is the regio that they started out, that we'd start out with. This is an early polity of whose antiquity we have no idea. And then it's given to the Abbey of Ely in 673. And it looks as though this is the area that I've colored in green, is the area that Ethelthryth's Abbey farmed entirely on its own account. This is its private domain land. It's nowhere acres there. There are no 60th penny, nothing. All that is absent from this area. But then at some point, Ely decided that it wanted more. This is the inland. At some point, it decides it wants more, and so it, in some way, gains hold of warland, wereland entities. So in Littleport, for example, which is an entirely manorialized parish by the Ville, by the time you get into Domesday Book, that those are still called ware acres. There's something significant about that land. And similarly down here as well. And so it looks as though Ely extended its holdings into the warlands, but it had to do it in consultation with the territorial courts which managed the commons, because it didn't have the right to appropriate the land otherwise. And then we come to Wisbech 100, where they're paying the farthing. So you can see that's happening. Oops. Up here, something different was happening. You'll remember that where they were paying the farthing, they were by 1250 paying it to the bishop, which is very naughty of the bishop. So if you look at in 1086, the bishops, in 1086, the abbey's domain in Wisbech amounted to just 600 acres. It's not very much bigger, nearly 2 centuries later. And the amounts of domain elsewhere are absolutely derisory. The only way the bishop was going to make money from the population of Wisbech 100 was by appropriating the 100 dues. And so that's what he did. He took the farthings and the gavels and he put them in his own pocket and didn't send them to the 100. And I think at that point he just brazened it out. He's one of the most important people in England, and he just brazened it out, even though he couldn't do it in other parts where the commoners were more powerful. When one looks at the classes of tenants, they're all free in some way or another. And so I suspect that behind that, we're looking at something that's more, we would be more familiar with in the South, but that is hidden between the entries behind the entries of the culture book. So when we're looking at modeling tradition and its relationship with adaptation, with evolution, and with innovation, what you can see in Finland is the integration of property rights with collective governance, with their livelihoods from grazing on the wetlands, from the oral traditions of custom and practice, from the informal networks that all these things gave us, and the long-term traditions of custom and practice that informed governance, that informed how you, the farming practice itself. social relations between people, all of that was going on in the background over very long periods of time and hadn't changed very much at all between, say, 400 and 1350. Of course, over that period, what one sees is political conflict. We know that that happens with the invasions from Scandinavia. There was the Norman conquest. There are the epidemics, the Justinianic plagues of the 5th and 6th centuries and so on. And so it's just, there's extreme weather events and so on. So there's all sorts of things happening in the foreground, which one can see, but actually what the changes that are really happening are these where you see increasing complexity of social hierarchy and social status, the evolution of kingship and lordship, changes to rights over land, the development and increasing formalization of manorialization, all happening in the medium term, but inhibited in Finland by this long-term collectivity which persists across the centuries until it's abolished by Charles I in the 17th century. It was only by abolishing property rights, to which people were legally entitled, that he was able to completely take control of the area. So these are very, very long-lasting changes. And I think that when you look at, if you look at landscapes and people in these terms, in what was going on over the long past and what was happening in the medium term, then one can find the balance between the two. And I'd just like to stop by saying that when men took their cattle out to grassland pastures in the spring, or cropped stands of sedge for firing, they took with them their unspoken understanding of the social relationships and that those rights represented, the responsibilities they entailed, and their expectations of equity and collectivity in their relationships with other right holders. The landscape itself, its carefully managed pastures, its reed and sedge beds, the meadows, the meres, the rivers, and the rough grazing were all mnemonics of free status, of common property rights, of public obligations, of solid livelihoods, and their long-standing oral traditions of custom and practice. And that's where that's what the book I wrote. So thank you. I'm sorry I've gone on too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Lots of food for thought there. Still reeling a bit from it, but yes, Megan's. I can never remember how to clap when I'm on the computer, so I'll clap just myself. Thank you very much. While people are collecting their thoughts and thinking about what kinds of questions they're going to ask, I'll take my chair's prerogative to jump in first. And I'm really struck by being a text-based person, making this leap from what the people in the elite people, the people who want to assert that kind of control that the bishop you were talking about, asserted over this landscape, and the difference between their view of the land and the view of the land that you've been explaining to us now. And I was just wondering how we can get a better access to thinking about these identities, these long-lasting identities that persist over generations. How do you think, what's the best way for us to go about trying to find our way with that? Is it through place name evidence, or I don't know, is that a clear question? How should we start learning about these identities?
To be honest, I think that, you just have to be as eclectic as you can. Every bit of evidence counts. People tend to be, historians, quite precious, about only documentary evidence. Archaeologists are very precious about only archaeological evidence. But actually it's rubbish, because when we make our own lives ourselves, we don't, when we've got the blue bin and the green bin, that's the archaeological stuff in there and the historical stuff in there. That's just the stuff that we use. So we just have to, given how much we don't know and how partial the evidence is that survives, we have to do, just, whatever you can find, you use. It's problematic though, because then of course, each one of those is a sphere of expertise. You know, people who spent decades just doing place names, and there you are, you've come in and you just do a little bit of it, and you never know if you're actually getting it right. Do your best. But I think the thing that what the Finland more than anything really showed me was if I had not done the work, if I hadn't done the geology, if I hadn't looked at where the water came from, if I hadn't looked at how the pastures were managed and read, you know, Natural England's guidance on how to manage meadows, if I hadn't done all of that, it wouldn't have made sense. It only made sense once I actually understood how they were farming the land. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm sorry, you know, I went on too long and I was over enthusiastic in my preparation, what I thought I could say. But I did hope to show you that, but it's in the book anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we've got a question for you, Susan, about records of medieval holloways, paths and highways. Do they show any patterns in the Fenland, which relates to the patterns of common and non-common land? That's a question from the chat.
Well, actually, you know, in Finland, this is a very difficult question. And that's why I showed you that map of where I found other references to these kinds of holding, because the landscape may be better. In Finland, as you know, the land was drained in the between the 17th and the 19th century. And in the meantime, it's been ploughed. I mean, there's a very colourful Finland expression about the extent to which it's been ploughed. There's nothing left. So we can't, it's very difficult for us to see, to work back from what we can see today to what was there then. We're very, very reliant on old maps. But in other parts of the world, that would be amazing.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions that have come from chat. One is, I understand that identity is created and affirmed by participation. And the question is, do you see forms of exclusion, of temporal exclusion, that would threaten identity?
In my own study. That's an interesting question. The trouble with rights of common is that one only sees them in a generality. They're not, people didn't trust written minutes, because as everybody knows, I'm sure you all know, the person who takes the minutes is the one who writes the history. Whereas if we all remember what we agreed today, then even if we disagree when we try to remember it in a week's time, we will still come to some consensus. So what I'm getting around to saying is we don't have the records which show those kinds of interactions in the level of detail that would show us exclusions, because we don't get records of those courts really until you get into pretty well the early modern period. They're very far and few between, because people didn't trust. Not only that, they also thought, oh, well, we can all remember what happened, so we shan't bother to write it down. And, you know, people have said that to me as well. So the kind of evidence that you're asking for is, it would be really interesting to find out. And maybe I'm wrong and there are sources you can find, but I don't know where they are.
Thank you. Here's another question that's quite interesting. Do you think that there's any useful comparison that can be made with the island of Axholm in Lincolnshire and the Fenland?
Well, now, all I know about the island of Axholm is, of course, what I've read of Joan Thirsk's work. But yes, I think the island of Axholm would be a very interesting parallel, because it's also, of course, a wetland. It used to be a wetland landscape. I don't, you know, go away and do it. Go away and do it. Publish it. Tell us all about it, because we need to know. You see, the thing about my Finland book is it's just one example. It's an example from which one can extrapolate generally. Of course, you can do that from any case study. But the more case studies we have that we can pile up, the more we can see where the similarities are across the whole and where the differences are, where I've made a mistake and where I've got it right. So go away, I need that. Please do something like that about rights of common in the medieval Isle of Axholm. I would love it.
Okay, thanks. quite a few other questions. Do we have an estimate of how many people might have belonged to each of the commons in the earliest period? So I'm guessing that that's the perhaps Romano-British times even, and how the collective management that you described, how it actually played out on a practical level.
Okay. Well, I think what I should have said, and what I had meant to say and forgot to say, is that a man who has rights of common is entitled to participate in the governance of the territory which that common, of that common. So if a man has rights of common in the whole of a territory, as they did in Finland, then he also is entitled to participate in the governance of the whole of that territory. Sorry, tell me again the question, because I've forgotten it.
I think it was, do we have an estimate of how many people might have belonged to each of the commons in the earliest period?
No, I'm sorry, I've absolutely no idea. I mean, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to stab one's finger and say yes? I mean, by the end of the Roman period, estimates are of a total population of probably around 3 million people. Finland was always well populated, so, you know, make my day and extrapolate from that, but I don't know, but enough. I was thinking today that if you took each of those pinheads and the average number of cattle held by a peasant in that period was something between about 5 and 10. Then we took a conservative estimate and said there were 10 people in each pinhead. That's say 50 cattle, and there are 10 pinheads in the territory, then that's 500 cattle. And then you add in the manorial cattle, you know, you're looking at lots, you're looking at thousands of cattle. And they used to talk about the cattle grazing horn under horn, you know, because they're horn under horn, lots of cattle. I don't know how many people.
Thank you. And another question that's just come up. Was there any noticeable difference between the identity between the different commons?
No. Well, how can I say no? Because I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. All I can say is that the rules governing each common were the same because they are universal. A common cannot work if you don't have those rules. It won't work. And the fact that those commons persisted, I mean, those commons, you can see them being used in prehistory. Then they're used in the early medieval period throughout the Middle Ages, and you can still see them being used into the 17th century. And that suggests that there was at least some uniformity in the structure of the governance, management, and regulation and exploitation of each of those commons.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a question that I've had for a while, because I remember reading your book on the train back from IMC several years ago when my train was delayed. And one of the questions, well, the biggest question for me is, what are the next steps in understanding the continuity between the Romano-British world and between the early medieval world and the world as it was in 1100 in the Fenlands? What are the kind of the directions that it can go in next?
I think if I were to have my wish, because I won't be doing it, but if I were to have my wish, I would like to see more histories, well, narratives, I suppose I should, not even narratives isn't the right word, but I'd like to see more books which explored the links between long term and the medium term, and mentioning the short term from time to time where it's relevant. But I'd like to see that interaction described, because we tend to describe only one level of process. And process isn't like that, it's multi-layered. It varies from one region to another in the same period. But the complexity of history is something that I would like to read more about. So I suppose that's where I would like it to go if I could.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions in the chat coming up. Here's one. You mentioned several times that you thought that that the commons and the communal property management was a system that went back a considerable length of time. Do you think this is a process which originated in prehistory?
Yes, absolutely, 100 million% yes. So it's possible to find evidence in the Neolithic for collective management of herds and flocks, and to find associated with them communal events. So if there's collective herd, all your animals go into a single herd, and then associated with the roundups of those herds in the autumn are feasting, other evidence of kind of partying collectively. And when they come and get their cattle, because when you come and get your cattle, you want to know you're getting all your cattle. And you want to know why that one's horn is broken and what somebody has done about that. And then actually, while I'm here, I've got a daughter and she's just getting ready to, she's just getting difficult. Please, could you, you've got a son that might like to marry her. There's a whole load of stuff like that that goes on at those kinds of collective events. And you can see them in the Neolithic associated with stock movement and management. And you can see them in the Bronze Age and in the Iron Age. And then to some extent, you can see them in the Roman period as well. And so you can see them all the way through, and that there's collective management of stock, that there are places where people meet to manage those stocks that stock at particular times of the year, particularly in the spring and in the autumn, and that when they do meet, they do particular things together. They don't do particularly the same things when they're feasting. They're not always eating, beef. They could be eating something else. They might have moved on from steak to kebabs, who knows? But generically, they're doing the same things year on year, century after century, millennium after millennium, right the way up into the medieval period and after. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe just a couple more questions. There's a question about language here. Terms such as farthing were important in your argument about continuity. Could you say something more about language? Does it matter that about language change?
Well, I'm not really sure it does matter. I mean, language just do change, don't they? Clearly they've changed across the, from prehistory. If you took say from 600 BC until 1200 AD, there's quite significant language change in different parts of the country, different rates, different sorts of language. But the rights of common continue to be practiced. So no, I don't think they're that important. I think in Finland, where Old English continued to be spoken, I think in some places, right the way up at least until the time of the conquest, or at least terms persisted. I think that is why you see a name like farthing coming up in the culture book, which obviously is written in Latin. There's also the question of, whether or not the clerks were able to translate the term into Latin. And Oliver Rackham has this marvelous example of how when the Bishop of Ely's clerks went to record the output of his woodlands, the loppings and chippings, they didn't know what the words were in Latin, so they just went in as loppium et chippium. And farthing could be the same sort of thing. It's just an archaic word that they didn't know what the other word, Latin word, was for it.
Thank you. Okay, we've just got one more question that's come up. Have the quarter session records survived from the 16th century for Wisbech, Whichford, Hundred, or Ely?
That's such a good question, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the answer. I mean, I think that, yes, they must have, they're very likely to have survived, but perhaps there's somebody else here who knows the answer better than I do. And that would be a fabulous source, again, to go and, to explore. Thank you. That's a great question.
It looks like I've skipped a couple of questions, so apologies to the people who asked them. So let's see, which have I missed? Is there a copy of the translation of the precursor to the Ely Coucher book available?
Yes. So the Coucher book, yes, it is available, and it's published by the Cambridge Record Society. I believe you can get it on that very larger online bookstore whose name cannot be named. But you can also get it from the Record Society itself. Cambridge Record Society, look at it online, and it's just heaven to read. I mean, I know I'm a geek, but it's heaven to read, honestly.
And the other question I missed Jane Clark's question. What do we know about the rights of the non-free population? Did they also have cattle and grazing?
No, I mean, they may well have had stock, but I don't think a lot. And they didn't have rights of common. The villeins, or at least they didn't have rights of common in their own right, but they could exercise the rights of common of the lord of the manor. So that villeins, although they didn't have the rights themselves and they didn't have the obligations that went with them, they couldn't do suit of court, they didn't do all those payments, but they could take their cattle out onto the commons to graze because they were the customary tenants of the bishop who did have the rights of common.
Thank you. Okay, I think I just have one more question, which is another question of my own, unless anyone else has any questions to ask. So your book's all about continuity, with these moments of kind of learning that are then kind of pulled back by the persistence of communal property rights. Of all the pressures upon communal property rights from Neolithic times all the way up to Charles I, which do you think are the ones that really had the most impact on the Fenlands?
Well, I think the thing about Finland was very lucky because it had very little arable. Had Finland been a predominantly arable area, I don't think those rights would have survived. They survived because the wetlands survived. And those wetlands were flooded every year. They could never be arable in a month of Sundays. So that was where, so the biggest pressure actually came right at the very end of that period. When Charles I just decided he was going to take it. He was going to have it and give it to his mates. And, you know, there's nothing anybody could do about it. And so I think that what you can see, if you're really looking there, you're looking at the balance of power between lordship and collectivity. And that balance is maintained because of the environment. But as soon as you get a power that is, in this case, the power of the state or the royal power, it's this power of the state really, which becomes so strong that the power of the commoners cannot any longer form a balance with it, then the system just disintegrates. But it doesn't disintegrate because there's anything wrong with the commons. It disintegrates, there's something wrong with the power of the state.
We have one more question that's cropped up actually, which is interesting in respect of your answer. Do we know if or whether outsiders or migrants could acquire rights of common?
Yes, yes, you could. Because the thing was that it wasn't it was not a personal status. The status was attached to the holding. So if you could buy a fraction or even a whole of 100ers holding, then you would have those rights of common. So yes, you could get them that way. Or if you could make yourself a tenant of the bishop, and there's a very nice example of this in March, where the bishop took on 90 tenants who each paid him 6p a year. They wanted the rights of common and he wanted their rents. And because he treated them as if they were villeins, even though they didn't have villain status, that was why they had the rights of common. So he was also playing the game a bit. You see, if there were ways, you didn't have to have a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and so on back into perpetuity in order to have these rights. And at the very beginning, you simply had to be a member of the territory and a free man. And if you could demonstrate both those things, it didn't matter where you came from.
And it looks like we've got one more question that's popped up in the chat. Was there any possibility of villeins moving up to free status?
There was, if they could buy their freedom. That's a really more general question. What one tends to find in Finland is that families operated as if they were part of corporations. So there would be one member who had a villain holding. There'd be another one who had a 100er holding. There'd be another one who paid rent for just a house, but had rights of common. And there'd be another one who had a right of fishery. So the family would distribute its members around the various ways of making money around the estate, which coincidentally also happened to coincide, it was overlap with different sorts of social status.
Okay, I think that's that's just about filled up our time. So thank you very much, Neville, for taking care of the questions and passing them on. And thank you, Susan, for handling that wide variety of different topics. I think we put you to the test there. But I'd just like all of you now, I'd like to invite everyone now to put your microphones back on or on for the first time. And please join me in a round of applause for our speaker. Thank you very much.